Hi everyone, welcome to Scitaris webinar. Today I'll spend 20 minutes talking to you about science-driven analysis in strategy consulting and investing and why you might find it to be an interesting career for you. So, we're actually two sister companies. As I mentioned already, Scitaris. Scitaris is an R&D strategy consulting firm with a sole focus on pharma and biotech, as well as SV Inflections, which is a biotech investment fund. Fundamentally, both companies believe that fundamental scientific analysis can drive real value generation in both of their respective industries. And this in-depth analysis is really underpinned by a team of fantastic PhDs who are capable of understanding the in-depth complexities of an exponentially expanding literature base, and how you can join dots between different papers, between different aspects of data together to really come to a holistic picture. So who are we? So Scitaris was founded last year with a partner group, the three of us, Jonathan, Sarah, and myself. And we were founded really with a common passion, a common goal, which was to use in-depth scientific analysis to really support innovative drug development in the industry. And the name of the company, Scitaris, is actually Latin for you seek to know, which we thought was a very fitting name for a company such as ours, which really founds itself on this in-depth analysis. And so we're already well known in the industry for our systematic science-driven approaches to problem solving, which we deploy at various clients around the globe, from large pharma, mid-sized biotechs, to even companies which at the time didn't have a name when we started working with them. So a little bit of history about the firm. As I've just mentioned, relatively young, founded last year. We were actually founded as SVI Consulting at the time, and we took on our first project. It was actually in response to the client requesting our time, which we decided to do. And then as the year progressed and we realized that this was actually building into a very interesting business, and we rebranded into Scitaris in November, and simultaneously hired our first two employees, Jonas and Minji, who are really the foundational employees for the firm. And then perhaps the most exciting point was the beginning of this year for the firm, where we officially publicly launched Scitaris at JP Morgan. And this is the seminal healthcare conference for the biopharma world. And this was very, very well received and really became a platform for the company. And after this, in the summer, SV Inflections actually had its launch, which had been brewing for 6 or 9 months as we collected investors and also dealt with numerous operational issues. And then in our first quarter, our fund actually outperformed the Nasdaq Biotech Index by 32%, which is a pretty impressive return in just 3 months. And so I'll tell you a bit about that later. And now we have 11 team members across both firms. And so you can see we've grown considerably in a year, or less than a year actually, and over 10 clients across the US and Europe. So this is really grown very, very quickly. So to give you a bit of a background of what kind of projects we do, I thought I'd take you through this. So we fundamentally support two things. The first one is a single asset strategy, and then the other one is portfolio corporate R&D strategy. So on the single asset strategy, we work on all stages of the value chain. To give you an example of this, I'll talk about a few projects. So in preclinical R&D, we have a client who asked us to support the strategic evaluation of a few targets they had in mind that they were thinking of developing assets for. And so this was a very, very early project. These are essentially ideas based on the literature. And so there was some fundamental questions here. The first one for them was, is this genuinely a good target in the context of what's available out there? And if it is, and the biological effect is what we think it might be, is there any other target in its pathway or in related pathways which might generate a similar biological effect, might be more tractable, might be less competition on them, and so to generate a holistic view of okay, out of all the options we have to generate this biological effect, this biological strategy we're going after, what is the best one? And so we did this for, obviously, as you imagine, pretty in-depth literature review, but also looking at the competition. Actually, mainly this particular project through the patents, because it was so early. And then also learning from how the target had been interacted with in alternative therapeutic areas, which wasn't the client's focus. So we can understand what was happening there, which might be applicable to their disease area. And ultimately bringing this all together to give strategic recommendations of how to approach the pathway, not just on a target level, so which target makes the most sense to hit, but also how to hit it. So what modality makes the most sense? Do we want to antagonize it? Do we want to internalize it with an ADC? Do we want to agonize it? Do we want a low avidity or high avidity agonism? And then also once that, getting some clarity around that, also how BD&L might, so business development and licensing, might help accelerate their efforts in this particular space by in-licensing relevant compounds. So a bit later on in the value chain, another project in early clinical development. So this particular client had an asset in early phase 1 in oncology, and this particular asset was a reasonably complex IO agent, which engaged certain cells in the tumor to basically cause them to attack the tumor, hopefully, and eradicate it. And the question here was, tumors are very different depending on which location they are in the body, depending on their genotype. And the question really here was what tumors and tumor microenvironments will most likely benefit from this particular drug, this particular way of modulating the immune system. And so we defined what would be the ideal tumor microenvironment with the client, and thought about this for a little while before we generated a database of hundreds of tumor subtypes and their immune composition. And this was possible actually from some recent work, really some excellent recent work published in Nature, where they generated immune RNA fingerprints for various immune cells in various states of activation. And then this is cross-referenced with the Cancer Genome Atlas, which is a massive database of cancer patient data, to essentially get at a single patient level their tumor microenvironment, which you can then aggregate together into many, many different subtypes. And so this is an extremely powerful piece of research which we utilize and adapted to our purposes. And then to that we attach competitive landscapes, further scientific validation metrics, clinical trial metrics, incidence and survival data, and then we could use this holistic scientific and non-scientific data to prioritize the tumor subtypes, which are the ones that are most interesting. So once we had this prioritized list, we then looked at the most interesting ones from this and did a high-level review to validate does what is available from the RNA fingerprinting from the database is what people have seen in the literature when they've actually looked at cells directly, when they've stained for activation, these sort of things. So this was the first step, essentially validation of what we'd already done to some degree, but then to get a bit more insights into what's actually going on in this particular tumor subtype. And it was quite nice to see that the concordance between the database and this was very, very high. And then the next step was to take the subset of tumors which we'd done a high-level review on, which were the most interesting out of that, and then do a multi-dimensional deep dive review. So this is where we looked at all aspects really made sense to look at for the indication, and included things like how to close scientific gaps for the asset. Sometimes there's outstanding questions about the tumor. We didn't have the data in the literature. And so doing some further preclinical work would probably gain you some confidence one way or another. So really highlighting those preclinical experiments which made sense to do. What R&D hurdles there were in this tumor type, the unmet need, the pay prior treatment implications, competition and addressable patients, and really bringing that all together for a holistic indication strategy recommendation. And then on the far end of this spectrum is the commercial side of things. As I mentioned, we're an R&D focused firm, so we don't focus on the commercial side very much. However, we do strategic forecasts and evaluations, and we've done this quite a lot in the past. And so one particular project that focused on this was an asset in early clinical development for multiple orphan diseases. And the question was pretty simple. It was what is the value for each of these, and what should we prioritize going forward, assuming resources are limited. And so to tackle this a bit, we looked at the scientific rationale of their molecule in each disease, and used this to define a target patient population. So what patients within the orphan diseases were most likely to benefit from this drug. And from this, you then can generate product profiles, which are essentially what you hope that the asset will generate, under different scenarios. And we took these to KOLs and basically asked them questions like, so would you prescribe this? Who would you prescribe it to? And what proportion of patients should you prescribe it to then get a feeling for, and also ask the KOLs a lot about the orphan disease itself and other hurdles and things to consider in clinical development. And so we then brought their input into essentially generate what would be a market share. Of course, with market share, you also need to have the epidemiology piece as the other main driver, along with pricing. And orphan diseases are characteristic in the fact that usually the epidemiology, the incidence, the prevalence isn't precisely understood, because usually you've got very small subsets, or you've got different studies that look at the disease in different ways, and so don't give you a very clear view on the particular incidence or prevalence that you may need. And so you have to bring a lot of numbers together to generate essentially a point estimate and a range, which is the most likely addressable patient population. And so then you can combine that with the work we've done with the KOL and the product profiles to essentially generate strategic forecasts. And what was quite nice about this is the CEO of the firm, in the meeting, liked the work so much that when the prioritizations made so much sense to him, that he immediately went to his CMO and prioritized the orphan diseases, which made the most sense. So that was pretty satisfying, and it was nice to make such an impact so quickly. And then outside of single asset strategy, you've also got all the corporate strategy parts, which you can see here. I highlighted. I'll just highlight one of the projects we've done, and that is, you often have a company with a particular phenotype this project applies to. So this is, they have an empty pipeline. This may be because they've sold everything, it may be because everything has failed, it may be because everything has succeeded and they just have royalties. They have a lot of cash, usually over 100 million. They have new management and a board open to or desires change. And what this generates is basically a company shell where the strategy can be pivoted quite strongly one way or another to generate value for the shareholders. And so with the teams, we define their strategic option space, which is usually a balance of capabilities versus opportunity, and then go on from this to generate a ranked database of opportunities. And this is using our proprietary ranking algorithm, and there can be either assets or companies depending on what the question is, what the company's desires are. And then we go through a similar high-level deep dive review process, which I described for the indications strategy earlier, before ending in a due diligence and on ongoing strategic support once a deal is done. And so what's quite nice about this is we've already, in our very relatively short history, already supported a number of very fundamental company-changing deals, which is pretty cool. So I hope that gives you some idea of the kind of work we do, which you can see, I think, from everything I've said is pretty strongly science-focused, and even in the more commercial or corporate strategy projects we do, they're all fundamentally scientifically driven from that very strong foundation. And really, like all the projects we do, you can describe the solution in really a set of buckets, which you always have to go through to some degree. Every project is different in how you go through these or how you address them, but fundamentally, you usually have to address most of them, even if it's not just simply to remove them from the list. And these are the 6, right? So it's scientific confidence, preclinical confidence, and clinical confidence. And this is essentially your data set for believing the drug will work. If the drug doesn't work, fundamentally, nothing else matters, because it won't work, so it will never get to market. And so these undoubtedly make the These are fundamental for success in the industry, and thus they're very important. And then you've got novelty and competition, so how you differentiate from what's on the market, what's in the pipeline. Commercial, does the investment make sense given the return potential? And then the company situation, so what is their capabilities, what is their strategy, what is their cost? So is this job something, is being an R&D consultant something that might interest you? Or you should consider it if you kind of like tick a few of these boxes or most of these boxes. So enjoying a broad knowledge development across many areas. I mean, I know myself from my own PhD how detailed you can be on one specific area, in my case, one specific protein. And so we generate knowledge across, a vast range of diseases, a vast range of scientific subjects, modalities, technologies, which is pretty interesting and pretty cool to do. You have to really like being systematic and adaptively approaching problems. This is a very consultant-like trait you need in order to really make sure you've prioritized correctly, you've considered all options in a meaningful manner, and by doing so you give the client a lot of confidence in the recommendation. You have to like presenting your work and want to become more confident in strategic discussions, and this will be with very senior company executives often, and they will challenge your work, so you have to be prepared to accept that challenge, and the result of that usually is a much better recommendation. You have to be able to work under time pressure sometimes, unfortunately. It's the way all industry is, and particularly consultants are sometimes brought in a bit last minute. Working in an international atmosphere, we have literally people from all four corners of the globe, which is, I think, pretty cool. And also like to travel a bit, although at the minute this is kind of curtailed. And ultimately, being self-responsible and wanting to develop into a manager role where you're really responsible for everything that goes on in your project is really what you're aiming for, because even if you move away from consulting, that's what the role you'll move into. So that's kind of like the goal. So I'd like to spend the last few minutes talking about our investment fund, which invests in public biotech sector, SV Inflections. And so this really came about from an observation that the stock market seems to be pretty inefficient for judging the success of drugs held in small biotech companies. And these are companies with no revenue, typically modest or low market capitalizations. And what we found from the work we were doing is that actually we seem to be pretty good at predicting which of these pharma companies and their assets would ultimately become successful. Initially, we were a little bit confused why this inefficiency existed. However, our speculation is now it's simply because a lot of the investment managers in the industry don't have an in-depth biopharma experience. As you can see here from this analysis we did from Barclays hedge fund database. Whereas what we have quite uniquely is that we've literally done evaluations on hundreds of drugs in many different contexts, granted either directly as due diligences or indirectly, evaluating competition, but many evaluations, and so we know what good looks like, and we also know when things are missing, which probably are red flags. And really what we wanted to, our aim to capture is the dramatic inflections that happen in the industry. So this is an example of Scitaris, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago now, when they read out their positive phase 3 results, and ultimately were taken over by Jazz Pharma, and they had a stock price increase of over 1,000% in this time. And of course you can get the flip side of that coin, a negative phase 3 result. This was Argos Therapeutics, who had a DC vaccine oncology, and which leads to a complete cratering in the market. As the stock price. But if you can predict these, you can capture these value changes, you can obviously generate a lot of value for investors. And so this is what we've done now over a number of years. So first with our personal accounts, you see here on the left-hand side, we've generated annualized returns of more than 100%, which is almost unheard of. And now most recently with the actual fund itself, which has now 27 million of assets under management. And in our first quarter, you can see our performance here. We outperformed the Nasdaq Biotech Index by over 30% just in 3 months, which is also pretty cool. And it really shows the power of scientific analysis in generating value for investors, and also validates what we do with the consulting. So thank you very much for watching. Really don't hesitate to reach out. We're very responsive. We're very interested in really stellar PhD candidates who would really like to join us and really and drive innovation in the industry through the consulting or drive value for investors by capturing value inflections with the fund. Thank you very much.